Hi there, I'm Dan Jones. Welcome to Interchange. Thank you so much for joining us. We have lots of things to talk about today. The Obama administration today ordered public schools to let transgender students use whatever bathroom they feel most comfortable using. We'll talk about the presidential campaign and whether all the Trump haters will bite their tongues and get behind him. We'll talk about professors at the University of Wisconsin campuses casting votes of no confidence whatsoever in UW leaders and the Board of Regents. And we'll discuss a possible move by the Catholic Church to allow women to be ordained as deacons. Before we get going, let me introduce my guest. Joining us for the first time is Louis Fortis, the owner, publisher, editor, top dog at the Shepherd Express newspaper. Louis is also a former Democratic state legislator, a former college economics professor. You know Kevin Fisher, who spent many years as a broadcast journalist here in Milwaukee, many years after that as a legislative staffer over in Madison. And of course, Denise Calloway, formerly a TV news reporter, now a communications and public relations professional. And Gerard Randall, education and job creation consultant. Rick Horowitz is going to be along with commentary in just a little while. All right, first let's talk about the directive from the Obama administration to all public schools in America today that transgender students must be allowed to use bathrooms and locker rooms that match their chosen gender identity. In a statement, John B. King, the Secretary of the Department of Education, who, by the way, is right across the street speaking at the MATC graduation ceremonies tonight, said that no student should ever have to go through the experience of feeling unwelcome at a school or on a college campus. Will this cause a huge uproar, Kevin, or is it much ado about nothing?
Oh, it's already causing an uproar because, as the lieutenant governor in the state of Texas correctly put it, what the president did with his executive order is that in the dark of night, he decided to push it out without consulting Congress, without consulting educators, without consulting parents who might have a problem with what he's trying to do here. And you talked about discrimination, that nobody should feel unwelcome. Well, fine. What about the other 99.7% of students? What about them? You know, this is just an expansion of the liberal agenda, which is to push political correctness and universal victimhood. And quite frankly, people with traditional morals and religious values are getting tired of having this pushed down their throats. And if you so much as raise a whimper or speak out in opposition or raise an issue, then you are immediately branded and called haters, which is not the case. So I would, this should be up to the local school districts. This should be up to the states. One superintendent in Texas said, you know, when I got the directive, I went right in the paper shredder. There is no force of law here, except that school districts are being blackmailed. If you don't go along with this, we're going to take away federal funding. I would say act on behalf of your conscience and not because of this threat from a lame duck president and it raises the question, what else is he going to push in his last 250 days in office?
Louis, if you had a kid who was in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, would you feel uncomfortable sending them to school knowing that a transgender kid might go in their bathroom? Would you bother? Would you care at all?
No. And I think as we look back, whether it's going to be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, we're going to look back and say, what was the big deal about this? And, you know, it's not like, gee, I woke up this morning and I decided to be a different gender. I mean, this is something that it has to be one of the most difficult things that people have to deal with in a lifetime. And so I don't think that, you know, I think this is probably a very reasonable reaction to a reasonable policy. And it really isn't this executive overreach. This is simply enforcing sex discrimination. I mean, maybe a little wider definition of sexual orientations and discrimination against sexual orientation, but it's very, very reasonable. And I think 10 years from now, we're going to look back and say...
So you think, and welcome aboard, there's a honeymoon period when you're first time on.
Oh, so you're going to be nice to me.
I don't know how long. I think it'll last.
No, I think it's over right now, so go ahead.
It's over.
But you use the word reasonable, so it's reasonable for men to walk into the little girl's room. Reasonable.
I mean,
I don't think so, and I think a lot of people would not think so.
Well, it isn't like, if you're just saying, you know, you want to walk in a women's bathroom, yeah, that's unreasonable, okay? But if you've been,
why is it reasonable for men to walk into a little girl's room,
because
but not vice versa?
They don't identify as men. I think that that's the important thing to take a look at. We're talking about people who identify with a gender different than the one that we may see or that they were born into. And Lewis is absolutely right. A process of someone who is transgender identifying with the gender that they feel best expresses them is not something you get up one morning and you say, hey, you know what, I'm going to be a man this week. That's not what happens. It is a long process. For many people, is an incredibly painful process of accepting for themselves what they really are, and then having other people do that same bit of acceptance. We're not talking about men going into the restrooms that are used by 5-year-old girls in a school setting. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is young people who have gone through the process of identifying as a different gender, being able to have the same kind of access and not being discriminated against. You would think that if you were in a situation where you saw someone who was dressed as a young woman in a high school, and a principal said to her, you've got to go to the boys' restroom. Any normal person seeing that would say, well, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. This is someone who looks like, acts like, behaves like a young woman. What we're saying is that it gives people the opportunity to fully carry out and experience the gender that they identify with. It is not about whether or not, to be really honest with you, Kevin, it's about protecting their rights.
It's also about protecting the safety of all students.
So you're making the assumption that someone who is transgender would also somehow be sexually violent? Is that what you're saying? I would really like to have you answer that for me.
Let me make this quick point. First off,
there's no danger.
How is it that all of a sudden we believe that these young folk can make these kinds of important decisions without any serious guidance, without any serious input from psychologists, from doctors, before the school jumps on board and says, you can go into any bathroom that you feel you want to go into?
That's not what it says. That is not what it says.
But that's what we're doing.
What it says.
That's what we're doing.
That is not what we're doing. That is not what it says. And what you're saying, I think in some ways, Gerard, I'm sorry, belittles the fact that these are conversations that young people oftentimes have with their parents, with their doctors, with their counselors, with their clergy. Again, you all are making the assumption that you can just walk up one day or wake up one day and decide you're going to be another sex.
I'll grant you that, but if they have personal issues, personal demons, confusion that they have to work out, they should fight that battle themselves and not push their behavioral choices on everyone else.
It's very insulting to people who are transgender to call what they feel somehow to be a personal demon. It is not. Any more so. Well, I'm just going to let that go.
I said
next topic.
I said
I don't want to say anything that's inappropriate to you.
Next topic.
I guess our honeymoon period
very
is
degrading.
Let's talk now about the presidential race. Republicans who can't stand Donald Trump are now being pressured to get behind him and support him, whether they like him or not. And on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders continues to be a roadblock in what had been expected to be Hillary Clinton's cakewalk to the nomination. First, we have to talk to Gerard, who has said for many months, you guarantee that Trump is not going to get the nomination. What do you say now?
So many times I had to put the knife away when I was ready to commit harikari. I don't understand it. I honestly don't. I would have staked a whole lot on my personal view that Trump would not be the party's nominee. And all of a sudden it just unraveled for reasons that are just inexplicable to me.
Because there's only one Wisconsin in the union.
Only one state that was wise enough to resoundingly reject him as a candidate for the party's nomination. That being said, now there's the conversation around bringing the various factions in the party together. And I don't think that's going to happen. It's certainly not been less than rocky road so far in trying to get many of those who are conservatives that have been steady conservatives in the party, espousing the views of conservative politics that have over the years kind of become the mantra of the Republican Party. And Trump has not been the person that has best reflected most of those views. So I don't know how he brings them together. Most people are going to say he's just paying lip service to the party's platform, that he has no intention of following through and implementing it if he does become president. And all of those who are wary of him, in fact, wary so much that they're looking at either a third-party candidate, or they're deciding not to vote at all for president, but just vote down tickets so that the rest of the party's ticket in various states don't become hurt. I think those are all legitimate concerns that the party has to face, and that Trump, as the party's leader, as the candidate, will have to face.
Louis, I'm interested in your opinion. How did the least Republican, the least conservative of 17 candidates rise to the top?
I think there's a lot of angry people out there. And I'm curious to find out whether, I was going to ask you, are you going to end up falling in line and supporting Trump?
No.
Okay. Okay. No, I think that, I think he tapped into an issue of people are angry. And people are getting, and that especially when the economy goes down, when you have a near depression, it brings out the worst in people. People get nervous. People get, very protective. People, and I think right now there's a lot of angry people out there, and he's feeding into that anger. I mean, whether blaming it on Hispanics, blaming it on Muslims, blaming is everybody around, and there's a lot of people that are just feeling real bad about things, and they're very happy to blame it on somebody else, and he's basically capitalizing on it. Because it isn't issues. You're absolutely right. He has no issues. He's, is he conservative on this? Well, maybe this week, and then the following week it'll be something different. So no, he's not. It isn't. This is what's driving Ryan crazy. Because Ryan is a very ideological guy. I mean, he's a very, kind of almost an extreme free market guy, and all of a sudden you have Trump who's, the entitlements are fine, or this is okay, and how are they going to come together? And Ryan has a lot to be nervous about, because Ryan wants to run for president some year, and if he embraces Trump right now, that's going to be kind of hung around his neck. He's also now the leader. He has to kind of provide some cover for his folks.
Kevin, some people think the next big surprise is going to be, okay, he's going to tap into the anger on the Democratic side too, and a lot of Democrats will vote for him as well.
Well, as I've stated on the program, the Republican Party is in shambles, but the Democratic Party is also a circus right now. They've got an issue where Bernie Sanders has become far greater than just a pesky mosquito. He's just sticking around and sticking around. He's not going anywhere because, one, he's got a lot of money, and number two, it's not a campaign for him, it's a movement. So he's out there day after day after day, not ripping the Republican Party, but ripping his own party. And I agree with Louis. I think the untold story here is that you have angry people, white, blue-collar people who are either underemployed or were unemployed and just have not been able to keep up. And because of that, no matter how bombastic Donald Trump is, they are enamored to him because they're just fed up with Washington trying to predict this thing. There's no conventional wisdom. There's no playbook you can go to. The speaker has an unenviable position of trying to please two factions. One that wants Hillary Clinton out at all costs. Understood. He has to fight for that. And number two, you've got this candidate who goes against all of the principles that he stands for. Tough position for him to be.
And there is no mainstream Republicans anymore. I mean,
There's all kinds of Republicans.
When you have Cruz and Trump, when the three of them were, and you had Kasich in the race, you had the three. Kasich kind of had the traditional Republicans, and the other two were polling, or getting, 75–80% of the vote. So where is this, mainstream Republican Party? It doesn't exist anymore.
It's not just that. You take a look at some of the things that very conservative Republicans have said, particularly about President Obama. And he's doing this to the country, he's doing that to the country. That has built up and fed this sense of anger that people feel. And Donald Trump is saying out loud what a lot of people think. And that's what's happened to the Republicans now. They have kind of created this monster, and now you got to live with it. And that really sucks for you.
We don't have to live with it, and we're not going
It's tough
to.
for you guys.
All right, let's
Bad.
talk for just a few minutes about the teaching staffs at some of the UW campuses, Madison, Milwaukee, some other ones. They cast votes of no confidence in the UW system president, Ray Cross, and the Board of Regents. They're unhappy with budget cuts. They're unhappy with the UW system tenure protections that are going away that some professors seem to enjoy a great deal. Is it smart to alienate those people who hold your financial future in their hands, or is this simply a ceremonial move meant to send a message of displeasure to Republican lawmakers that you can't keep doing this?
Oh, I get first shot at this? Sure. Okay.
Baptism of fire.
Okay, if the faculty came to me, which they certainly won't do, and say, you know, should we, or a faculty member, should I vote for this? And my question to them would be, do you want to do some kind of symbolic kind of political statement, or do you want to win? And I don't like to lose. And I would say to them, why don't you take a little different strategy and actually try to win? And I would start out by just looking at where the various faculty live. A lot of them live, especially when you start, even at UWM, a lot of them live in districts where either the state representative or the state senator are Republicans. But when you get like around Whitewater or Oshkosh, the majority of the faculty are in areas that are represented by Republicans. And you bring together as large a group as you can of faculty, you bring your state legislator out, because they'll come out. If you got 15, 20, 25 people that want to meet their legislator, they're going to come out and they're going to talk to you. And then I think it's up to the faculty to begin to explain what they really do and why it's important and what's happening with education. Because I think you look at every civilized country in the world is expanding their education. They understand that that's the way to grow as a democracy or aspiring democracy. They're the one that they understand that it's linked to job creation, economic development. And in Wisconsin, we're doing the exact opposite. We're cutting back on all of this. So I think it's a question of, and all the Republicans have just fallen into line. I think it's important to pick them off one at a time, explain to them what you do, work with them, and not threaten them. You can always do that at the end. But I mean, you start out trying to work with them, trying to educate them, and trying to bring them around and say, wait a second, this is going too far. And that's what I would be advising them. I think a symbolic vote like this, it's easy to do, and you can grandstand and that, but it's not doing anything. And at worst, it's actually doing some damage.
You were on the Board of Regents. Does the Board of Regents truly care that the faculty at Stevens Point or Madison or Milwaukee doesn't like them?
Well, the board has changed significantly since I served on the board. I will say this, though.
I mean,
yes,
as a body, does that board even care what the faculty thinks?
As a body, they do care because there's still the element of shared governance. And so at some point, the regents will have to make some type of adjustments, acknowledging that shared governance is a part of the law and it's a part of the tradition of the system. And I want to say, too, that when these budget cuts first began back during the Doyle administration, $250 million plus he cut from the budget, but they were always offset by tuition increases, steady tuition increases that ultimately parents and students began to rail against. So when the Walker administration says you're going to take the cuts, but you're not going to put it on the backs of families, the irony is that families are happy that we've got the freezes, that we still are going to maintain our commitment to quality, but the faculty are the ones that are screaming the most, because one of the ways in which they are, I guess, challenged to meet these budget cuts is by teaching more classes, cutting back on the number of adjuncts that are in the classrooms. And so one of the ways I think that you're going to have some type of happy accommodation reach is by relaxing somewhat on the ways in which universities can make up for the difference in what the tuition generates and what the cost of instruction is going to be for a high-quality campus.
All right, we got to keep moving along. Pope Francis says he'll study the possibility of allowing women to become deacons in the Catholic Church. That's a surprise. A deacon isn't a priest, but they can baptize children, they can preach, they can perform wedding ceremonies, but it's always been a role reserved for only men. Would something like this breathe new life into a struggling church here in America, or, Kevin, would it alienate the traditionalists?
I think a little of both. And let's not jump to conclusions here, all right? The Pope, before we start ordaining women as deacons, the Pope has said that he will just have a commission study the matter. And then when the commission comes back, it'll have recommendations, and who knows what the Pope is going to do. It's not the first time he's called for such a commission. He's done it several times in the past. And then the pattern is that he goes off on his own way and doesn't follow the recommendations that are set. I guess it depends who you ask how serious this is. I think there's a lot of folk that wouldn't mind seeing women as deacons in the church, and I mean, especially if they're effective and can help and do the job. But I think there are others who are so staunchly old school that, well, let me give you an example. I usher at my church every Sunday, and this happened many, many years ago. We were short of ushers, and so we asked a young woman in the back of church who came religiously with her family every Sunday to go and pass the basket. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see a problem with it, but you should have heard the complaints I got after Mass was over. And that's not even as important as a deacon. That's like an altar boy and porter. So you're gonna see some angst, because anytime you mess with any kind of old doctrine or principle, there's going to be people in the pews that are upset.
Denise, does it seem weird to you that there's a church where you can't be a priest, you can't even be a deacon?
No, but the Protestant church, in Judaism, women are leaders of the faith. They are. They're priests, they're rabbis. Their word is seen as being the word of God, not the word of a man. And so I don't understand why this is such a big issue. If you take my particular denomination, the Episcopal Church, we have actually had a woman who has been in charge of the entire Episcopal Church in the United States, and the walls did not come crumbling down. This is about letting people express and fulfill what they see as their religious calling. I believe God calls us all to do certain things. And if you are a woman and you are called to be a leader in the church to help perform sacraments, you're out of luck if you're in the Catholic Church. And so I think that what's happening is Pope Francis realizes that the calling is not, to maybe tie it back to something we talked about earlier, gender specific. He calls people to serve, and you have the opportunity to do this if you're a woman. And you should.
He's very open-minded, but some people, some real strict Catholics, don't like the fact that he is that open-minded.
And again, it's what are you there to celebrate? Are you there to celebrate the doctrine, or are you there to celebrate the word? If you're there to celebrate the word,
but the argument
shouldn't make any
is that
difference whether it comes from a man or woman.
In the church.
All right.
Maybe not as deacons, but there are many roles they can play.
Back to presidential politics for just a minute, okay? It may have happened sooner than anyone predicted, but it had to happen eventually. The Republican power structure trying to wrap their minds around the idea of Donald Trump winning their party's nomination. And how's it going so far? Rick Horowitz can only imagine. Rick.
In which the GOP establishment considers the sudden ascendancy of one Donald J. Trump. Okay, let's think this through. He says whatever pops into his head. On the other hand, the man knows how to dominate a news cycle. He can be rude, even crude. He says exactly what's on his mind. People are tired of political correctness. They want authenticity. He's insulted practically every other Republican leader in the entire country. But he's bringing all these new people into the party. That's how he beat Hillary. He's been a Republican for about a year and a half. Hey, Ronald Reagan was once a Democrat too. If Trump thinks we're the right home for him, we're glad to have him. He disagrees with lots of Republican foreign policy, with Republican trade policy, with Republican tax policy, with Republican bathroom policy. So what? We're a big tent party, aren't we? And it's like Lyndon Johnson always said, better to have the guy inside the big tent peeing out than outside the big tent peeing in. as long as he's in the right bathroom while he's doing it. He changes his positions all the time. That comes from making all those deals. It's a plus. You can always make a deal with Donald Trump and a different deal tomorrow and a different deal the day after that. What's wrong with a little flexibility? Would you rather have Hillary? He doesn't know his butt from the B-2 bomber. He thinks nuclear triad is a chewing gum. Dick Cheney endorsed him, didn't he? So Cheney must think he has potential. Maybe he can advise him. The man is a scumbucket. He demeans women, threatens Muslims, stokes fears about Hispanics, mocks people with disabilities. He has no respect for the truth. He appeals to people's worst instincts. In an election year, let's call that one a wash. Okay, one more. Worst comes to worst, putting a guy with Trump's lack of knowledge of history or policy, his total lack of self-control, his infantile temperament, putting a guy like that in charge of our nuclear arsenal could turn the planet into a steaming pile of radioactive ash. But at least he's not Hillary. Yeah, I think we're getting there.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.